Welcome to Sinai Speaks, our weekly edition where we engage with rabbis and scholars and teachers from all around the world. This week, we are honored to join a chavruta of mine, Rabbi Pini Dunner of Young Israel of North Beverly Hills, a neighbor, but ironically, we spent Shabbat for the first time in Miami just a couple of months ago as part of the Jewish National Fund USA conference. One of the most amazing Zionist rabbis, not just in Los Angeles, but in the country and the world. Your work within the interfaith aspect of literally bringing people together, bringing Klal Yisrael together, and this is really an exciting conversation. When I was asked to read this book called, I quote, Paradise Cove, They Escaped the Cuckoo's Nest, I didn't exactly know what world I was entering into, as you can see behind Rabbi Dunner. Amazing Sfarim and Talmuds and Jewish books. But Paradise Cove, Entering the Cuckoo's Nest, I didn't understand what I was walking into. And I can say that I had trouble putting this book down because it is a message for the ages and it is a message for all, for Jews, for those who are not Jewish, for young, for old, and also within this world of mental health, which we'll be able to explore as well. Rabbi Dunner, it's wonderful to have you in our Beit Midrash here on this
It's an
wonderful day.
absolute pleasure. And I look forward to spending Shabbos with you again, if not before, but at least next year in San
In San
Diego,
Diego, yes,
closer to Miami.
a plug to
And
join us in the Jewish National Fund Conference.
perfect.
So let's talk about, before we actually enter the content of the book, an article in Times of Israel that I read recently about how you have a skill to find really hidden stories that need to be brought to the world to be told, which is specifically Paradise Cove, but you've done this in other ways too. So maybe share with us that hobby and passion of what it looks like to find untold stories that need to be told to the world.
I have this idea that the greatest stories of history are the ones you don't hear,
Mhm.
about the people on the margins. Years ago, I wrote about the story of Dottie Rothschild, or Dolly Rothschild, who was the wife of Lord Rothschild, who was the one who facilitated the Balfour Declaration. I
Mhm.
don't think you ever hear about her. She was
Nope.
a friend of Chaim Weizmann, and she was very taken by him, and she introduced her husband to Zionism, and one thing led to another, and the Balfour Declaration arrived at Lord Balfour's door. So the idea that it's only the people you hear about, like Chaim Weizmann and Lord Rothschild, that make the difference is just simply not true. The people often who make the difference, or the people who do meaningful stuff, are the people who are, who are on the margins. I'd like to say this. We're now in Sefer Shemot. It's the midwives who saved the Jewish babies, and it's Moses' sister who saves him from the brook and from the Nile. And it's Pharaoh's daughter, whose name we don't even know. She's Batya, right? The daughter of Pharaoh. We don't even know her name. She saves Moses by looking after him and bringing him up in the palace. And yet it's Moses who's the great hero of the Jewish people. That's the one we read about for the rest of the Torah. So the idea that it's only people who are in the spotlight that actually make the difference is not true. And therefore, I always seek out these marginal people. Sometimes they're, curious in the wrong kind of way, but they really round off the whole story of Jewish history.
Interesting. I was in Disneyland yesterday with my children before they went back to school, and we went on the Soaring California ride, and it was all about air flight, and realizing that it took a while to get to the Wright brothers, and all these little people that you never heard of that I found out about yesterday were the ones who actually allowed the airplane to be made so that the Wright brothers could take off. And the same thing within Jewish history. And so, take us to the Yablona Rebbe, who none of us really had heard about, but has an unbelievable life. First as a Rebbe, then as a, I guess, psychologist, which we'll delve into in a little while.
What you'll discover, those who read the book, will get to it. I have a copy here.
I only have the
It's
PDF
just
because
come
you
out.
this copy, but
But
yes.
the what you'll discover is that this man was the master of reinvention. He reinvented himself on a number of occasions, and the most startling reinvention actually takes place after Paradise Cove, but we'll get to that. The Yablon Rebbe was born into a rabbinic dynasty. He was a Polish Hasidic Rebbe. There were many Polish Hasidic Rebbes, probably many hundreds of them. Some of them A-list. So you may have heard of the Gerer Rebbe and the Alexander Rebbe and the Bobover Rebbe. These are names which people who know about Hasidic history will be familiar with. But there were hundreds, if not thousands, of little Hasidische Rebelech, or Gitte Yidden as they were called, who maybe had a shtibel with 50 people or 20 people. And then there were mid-ranking Rebbes, also all of them from Hasidic dynasties that dated back, let's say, 150 years or 120 years. And they were, third or fourth or fifth generation Hasidic Rebbes. And they were the rabbi of a town, and that also meant that they were the Hasidic Rebbe in their locale, in their community. And they would have hundreds, maybe thousands of Hasidim. So the Ger Rebbe had probably more than 100,000 Hasidim, and the Bobova and the Radomska, they had probably 100,000 or 200,000 Hasidim in Poland. There were 3 million Jews in Poland. But the Jablona Rebbe probably had 2, 3, 4, 5,000 Hasidim, mainly in Jablona, which is a satellite town outside Warsaw, where people would go away for weekends. And probably he had a Jablona Shtibel in Lublin and one in Warsaw, and etc. In Lodz, in the other big
City Valley.
so some local representative there, and he would visit them from time to time. Now his father, we're talking about the Jablona Rebbe who's featured in Paradise Cove, but his father, who was the first Jablona Rebbe, descended from Rabbi Yecheskel Taub of Kushmish, he was the founding kind of rabbi of that dynasty. The Jablona Rebbe's father, Rabbi Yaakov Taub, died at the age of 59 or 60 in 1920. At that time, the Jablona Rebbe was 25 years old. He was educated rabbinically. He was fluent in Polish, in Yiddish, and in Hebrew, probably also in German. And I would suspect that he had a familiarity with Russian. He was well versed in literature. I would suggest that he was on the more modern end of the Hasidic Rebbe kind of spectrum, if we understand that. He wouldn't have looked it to you. He had a long beard and payas and a big yarmulke, and he wore a black frock coat and a big black hat, and I'm sure a fur hat on Shabbos. But he was, for all intents and purposes, a little bit leaning towards the more modern end of the Hasidic Rebbe spectrum. He was very reluctant. We've just discovered a letter in which he says he was extremely reluctant to take on the leadership. They had meant to give it to his brother-in-law who had predeceased his father. His brother-in-law obviously couldn't do it. He was the only son. I don't know if there were other brothers-in-law, and the Hasidim insisted that he take on the leadership of the Jablona Hasidic group, which he did in 1920. As he said, he was reluctant, and he literally only did it because they wanted him to, and they were asking him to serve this very large group who wanted a leader, and therefore, even though he felt unfit for the job, he took it. This is 1920. He becomes a Zionist. I don't need to tell you. There's not many Hasidic Rebbes in Poland who are Zionists. There are a few. They're mainly from the Koznitz and Rizhin branches of the Hasidic Rebbe spectrum, in varying degrees. But essentially, to be a Hasidic Rebbe meant you were against Zionism, certainly secular Zionism. And the idea that you would support a resettlement of Jews in the land of Israel was just completely outside the field of interest of a Hasidic Rebbe operating in Poland in the interwar years. However, those that were Zionist leaning were very passionate about it. After the Balfour Declaration, which I mentioned already, after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there was this possibility. The British took over and they encouraged immigration. They knew that the Jews who came were very eager to serve the land, and they were going to get involved in all the infrastructure projects that the British were generating, and that there would be money. If the Jews came, there would be money to build up what had been Ottoman Palestine, which was the southern region of Syria. It wasn't a country. It was a region of a particular area of the Ottoman Empire, which had been utterly corrupt. Anybody who was ever put there from the Ottoman Empire just done what they could to take as much money as they could back home. They certainly didn't care about the local citizens or whatever, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire. The British had a different take on it. They felt responsible. And for that, the 25 years that the British were in charge of what was called Mandate Palestine, they completely changed the country. Suddenly there was running water, there were roads, there was a train, there was all kinds of things that were happening because the British were there. And they encouraged Jewish immigration, at least until the White Paper of the late 1930s. So as part of that trend, religious Jews also began to immigrate to Palestine. but not like the Yablona Rebbe. What he did
Right.
was unique. He led his entire community. He said, if I'm a Chassidish Rebbe, then these people are my followers. I'm going to take all of them. I'm not going on my own. He had cousins who went on their own, other Rebbes, who, came with 20, 30 people. He's not coming with 20, 30 people. I want to build the land. This land is ours. This land is the land of our heritage. We shouldn't leave it to the secular Zionists. It's us, the religious Jews, who should take hold of the land and make sure that it flourishes again, as it did in the days of the Bible. And it was a messianic project. He came in 1925 with hundreds of people, of followers who followed him, people much older than him. If you look at the photos of him, you can see some online. I have a website dedicated to the book, paradisecovebook.com. There's a whole bunch of photographs in there. You can see one of them with him, with his Hasidim. He's a young man with dark hair and dark beard. And his Hasidim are older people in their 50s and 60s, but holding farming implements. They took 10,000 dunams of land, that's thousands of acres of land in northern Israel, near Haifa in the Jezreel Valley. It's biblical names, right? And he wanted to make it flourish as it had in the days of the Bible, as I said, and that was his project. He created something in the name of his father, Nachalat Yaakov. Eventually it became known as Kfar Hasidim, because that's what it was. It was the village of the Hasidim, and he was the leader. And that was his role, and that's who he was. He became quite famous, I guess, not in terms of being a front runner for fame in the Jewish world, but he was a curiosity, a Hasidic Rebbe who had taken his followers to pre-state Israel and created this agricultural community in a village and farmland in northern Israel. And essentially, that's the role that he sought for himself as the Hasidic Rebbe of the Yablona Hasidim. But that's not how his life unfolded.
So the Yablona Rebbe doesn't say that on the book cover. It says George Nagel.
That's right.
Sounds very different than that. My jaw dropped when I realized who this person was. And so how does the Yablona Rebbe become George Nagel at California CSUN? It's Cal State Northridge.
It's quite a journey. He was not successful. Sadly, the project in Kfar Hasidim went through so many difficulties, financial difficulties, practical difficulties. I mean, think about it. Take a bunch of Hasidim from Poland and turn them into farmers. It's not something because it's not natural, right? And he really didn't know what he was doing. He was a young man. He was very sharp and very bright and all of that, but he hadn't anticipated all the hurdles that would come his way. And there were many hurdles. I'll give you one example. The local Arabs who had been bought out, there was a landlord, a landowner in Lebanon. They bought all the land, but the local tenant farmers, the Arabs, didn't want to leave. They were paid. They said, okay, if you pay us, we'll leave. They paid them the money. They didn't leave. They became very hostile. There were murders. They poisoned the wells. I mean, all the stuff that you read about in history books, it actually happened in a macrocosm in Kfar Hasidim. And there was swamps, there was terrible rain. Then there was mosquitoes. Then there was malaria. People got very disappointed. They missed home. They went back to Poland. Eventually, he raised money. He kept on raising money and reaching deals with the Zionist authorities, with Keren Kayemet, which JNF, we mentioned JNF, right? So Keren Kayemet, and they helped him. They brought farm workers and they cooperated with the Hasidim, and things started to work out. Then the anti-Semitism of the 1930s, and some of his Hasidim who hadn't come yet came and claimed the land that they paid for, and obviously it wasn't there anymore. And then there were a couple of murders, and he was blamed, and people asked him for money, and they said he was a thief. I mean, whatever could go wrong went wrong. He goes to America. He arrives in 1939 in America, and he's staying with his niece. He's raising money for Kfar Hasidim, and the war breaks out. The war breaks out. He can't get back to Europe. He can't get back to Palestine. He's stuck in New York. He tried to join the military. They weren't looking for 40-something-year-old Hasidic Rebbes to fight in the US military. Right. So he joined a shipbuilder's yard in Los Angeles. That's how he got to Los Angeles. At that stage, still Rabbi Yecheskel Taub. There's a report of him visiting Southland in 1941 as Rabbi Yecheskel Taub, the famous Yablona Rebbe. And he slowly but surely is, getting used to Los Angeles when he hears about the Holocaust. At that stage, we don't have a record of it. He must have had an unbelievable crisis of faith. He realizes all his followers in Europe have been killed. If you want to see, there's a photo online of the hangings, public hangings that took place by the Nazis in Jablona very soon after the outbreak of World War II, which was September 1939. But he only heard about it in 1942. He also can't go back to Palestine because, he's got the hostility there of all the Hasidim towards him. They hate him because he's stolen their money and their friends were killed or died. So, he feels that he's got nowhere to go. He never wanted to be a Rebbe in the first place, right? He says, right. What am I a Jablona Rebbe for? The whole thing is, and I'm not sure what I believe in anymore. He doesn't have any family. He's on his own in Los Angeles, cuts off his beard, shaves off his payas, takes off his kaftan and his black hat, changes his name to George T. Nagel. T is the only remnant of his old name, Taub, George T. Nagel. And he becomes an immigrant, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Los Angeles. Nobody knows who he is. And that's how he became George Nagel, having abandoned his original title and original name and original calling as a Hasidic Rebbe. He becomes a residential contractor, developer in the Valley, in the post-war housing boom, and becomes quite a successful, wealthy man. This little Polish immigrant had learned a lot. He'd built Kfar Hasidim, he'd worked in the shipyards, he understood contracting, understood mechanics, he understood all the things that go into development, and he had a shrewd business mind and became a successful man until the late 1960s. 1960s, his business went bankrupt. He had a nephew who lived in Los Angeles. His family obviously knew who he was and where he was. And his nephew said to him, why don't you come back to Israel? He said, I'm not going back. They all hate me. He says, well, what are you going to do? You're in your 70s. What are you going to do? You don't have a business here. What are you going to do? He says, I've always wanted to study in university. What are you talking about to go to university? What are you going to study in university? He said, I want to study psychology. And he enrolled at what was then called San Fernando Valley University or College, now known as CSUN, California State University of Northridge. Lived in the dorms, co-ed dorms, can you believe it? And I mean, it's inconceivable today, right? It's an old man in his 70s living in co-ed dorms with teenagers. I mean, it's like, can you imagine such a thing today? It just wouldn't happen. Studied psychology, graduated in 1975 at the age of 80 with a psychology degree. And it's at that stage that Paradise Cove, the book, which I've just published, comes into being.
And so let's talk about the Paradise Cove aspect, which is a series of letters or sort of diaries, I believe, to his PhD doctoral.
Yeah, but it's not doctoral, it was a master's thesis.
Right. And it's this Paradise Cove, which is basically a halfway house for people who were at that time considered mentally ill, before mental health was really ever spoken about publicly.
Yeah, so this is interesting. This is an interesting point, which here in California we can talk about because people know about it. Ronald Reagan decided to shut down all the insane asylums, right? I mean, that's well known here. Around the world, people don't know that. What happened to all those mental patients? Like, what actually happened to them? So what they did is they came up with this kind of semi-solution, which is they opened what they called halfway houses, but were really quasi mental health institutions or facilities where the patients were free to go in and out as they wanted, but generally they wanted to stay there. So they weren't locked up. But it was an opportunity to reintegrate them or to integrate them into the local community. So these were very unique facilities that existed in the 60s and 70s, late 60s and 70s in California. And it's at one of those that he calls, by the way, Paradise Cove. It wasn't the name. He calls it Paradise Cove. He likes the concept of paradise, he says, because nobody really knows where paradise is, and he doesn't want people to know where this place is. So he said he becomes a volunteer at Paradise Cove at one of these facilities, and he tells his professor, his tutor, her name was Professor Helen Geet. He says, I'm going to write you field reports,
Right.
and please count that towards my master's. In an interview he gave, he said he was very, very lazy. I mean, he's hardly lazy, but that's the way he refers to himself. I'm lazy. I can't be bothered going to classes and taking exams, so I'm going to write field reports. What starts out as field reports, as you've read now in the book, actually evolves into very personal descriptions of his experiences at this facility for, I guess, psychiatric patients. It's wonderful.
And so you wrote a couple of things actually in introduction, which really sets the tone. You said, I quote, he lost his faith, but not his mission. He stepped away from leadership, but not lifting people up. He may have stopped acting like a Rebbe, but he never stopped being one. What did that look like in Paradise Cove as he began to understand that he was still the Rebbe there?
So what will strike people most about Paradise Cove is that it's all a bit banal. By which I mean, like, we know who he is. So we're like kind of hovering over his shoulder, knowing that this man is a Hasidic Rebbe who had thousands of followers, and that he managed to convince to come to a third world country in the 1920s. And now he's just this little old anonymous man, and he's probably thinking that to himself as well, right? He knows who he is, even if nobody else does. And he's dealing with these petty day-to-day issues that affect mental health patients, and also the staff. Like, he gets involved in staff politics and the politics of whether or not there should be group sessions or shouldn't be group sessions, and whether or not people should be helped to get out of the facility or they should be forced to stay, medication issues, like all the issues we're aware of somewhat. He's involved in. He's not a professional, so he's kind of an observer, fly on the wall. He's looking at this situation, and he's writing with incredible wisdom, and he knows so much. He's had so much life experience, and of course he's educated. He's a rabbi. He has been a leader, a real leader of people, a very charismatic leader. And he's watching this, and he's telling his professor, I saw this today, I saw that today. And just before we started this conversation, I was talking to you before we began filming, talked about his relationship with the Reform rabbi in Northridge. A fascinating relationship, if you think about it, where he's telling the rabbi, I think you should do more Bikur Cholim in your shul.
Right.
And I'm sure the rabbi had no idea who he was. He just thinks he's little old, George Nagel. He doesn't really realize he's Yecheskel Taub, the Yablon Rebbe. And he's kind of educating the Reform rabbi. I think Bikur Cholim would be a good idea. We need to help these people. And the way we help them is by relating to them in a real and personal way, not by treating them as numbers and as outsiders. We need to be involved with them. We need to bring them into our community. We need to involve them in our lives. That's how he's a Chassidish Rebbe. Because notwithstanding his abandonment of faith, maybe of any kind of practice of Judaism, he had been an Orthodox rabbi. Now he's not observing Shabbos. It's clear. He even jokes about himself that people call him a good Christian.
Oh yeah, I was good. That was my next question.
So,
yes.
And yet he retains somehow the wisdom, even the quiet, laid-back majesty of a Hasidic Rebbe, which is remarkable if you think about it.
And so I want to talk about theology for a moment, because in the book he writes, and this line really struck me. He wrote, I wish I had God's phone number so I can ask him, what does he gain for confusing so many people? Right? And I thought to myself, wow, if us in our profession had God's phone number for so many of the people that basically are asking for God's phone number when they come in our offices, and what does God gain for bringing suffering to these people that actually the Yablona Rebbe is sort of trying to heal 100th at a time? The reminds me of the Rabbi Yochanan story in the Gemara that just holding the hand can actually help in this Bikur Cholim. What is the role, do you think, of his theology as this Hasidic Rebbe in George Nagel's body during this time of Paradise Cove?
I think he struggled. I think he struggled because of his own tragedy. You know, think about a man with a messianic dream. God's on his side. I'm taking the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. He's like Moses, taking them through the wilderness to the promised land. And the whole thing flops and is a failure. Comes to America, he loses everything. And he's only successful in any kind of way when he's not religious. I mean, the man must have really struggled with his faith theologically. He calls himself, he says, I'm not an atheist, but I don't believe in miracles. He says at one point, he said, maybe I'm an agnostic. He laughs at the fact that he's referred to as a good Christian because he's such a kind person, as if Jewish people aren't kind.
Right.
He is able to step out of his body in a way and look at himself and see the incongruous nature of who he has become and what he's trying to do. And he's really saying, like many people said, like Viktor Frankl said in his book, but that book is much more famous. What is the meaning of all this, and how are we to draw a meaning out of all this? Now, he's not talking about the Holocaust, although he was affected by the Holocaust. He's talking about the day-to-day real life of mental health patients who come from fairly normal families, many of them. They don't come from families where there's abuse or anything like that. Saying, what was the point? Why create these people for them to struggle throughout their lives with their relationships, with all kinds of, even the most banal things, with their weight. He comments a lot on the way people look. People are very fat and they let themselves go. I can see that she was once pretty, but look at how she looks now. So he has such a sensitivity to that. And he sees that, if we believe in God, we've got to really try and make sense of it. And he's struggling to make sense of it. And of course, this is before the chapter at the end of his life, which we haven't yet got to. But as he's going through this, a year and a half, roughly a bit more, that he spends at Paradise Cove, and the title he gives it, the subheading of the book is "They Escape the Cuckoo's Nest." And of course, that's a very famous film, originally a book from the 1970s, one who escaped the cuckoo's nest. But he didn't, did he? Jack Nicholson in the film Never Gets Out, Nurse Ratched. He's always making sure that nobody can leave the mental health facility. And the only way he gets out is he has a lobotomy. And clearly this has left a really strong impression on George Nagel, on the Jablonner Rebbe. He wants them to escape the cuckoo's nest. Wouldn't it be wonderful if this mental health facility didn't even exist? He wants them to get out and integrate into society and be happy people. And I think that as the book progresses, he sees how difficult that is. Some people just can't. They can't escape their mental health prison. And even if they would be out, there's nothing much for them to do in life. And I think that's what he's addressing by hoping that he could have, or wishing that he could have, God's phone number. If he could only have an explanation as to what's this all about, just explain it to me.
And so it's interesting that this comes up during this time period. First, before October 7th, at Sinai Temple, under the leadership of my wife, Rabbi Nicole Guzik, she began a Sinai Temple mental health center because she saw that we shouldn't just be going there, but sort of as the Jablonner Rebbe told Rabbi Kleinman at Ahavat Shalom, you need to be part of their life and they need to be part of your life. And so we brought the mental health center alive so we don't have to outsource these challenges that can actually be served within a religious community. What do you see as the role of, learning from what the Jablonner Rebbe did in Paradise Cove to what we can learn as rabbis for our own communities in terms of the mental health, I would call it, crisis within our world. And then we'll extend it actually, especially to Israel, where mental health has become something that is just so desperately needed after 10/7 for our chayalim, for our chayalot, for our hostages, for our Nova survivors, for everybody. Where does this play a role for us as rabbis today?
So I think that unlike George Nagel in the 1970s, and he was a pioneer, we are much more aware of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, that if something happens to you and you think you've recovered, look, I've coped, I'm here, I didn't get injured, that actually your mental health can take a real knock, and it only comes out in ways that you can't describe. Maybe you can't sleep. Maybe you're very snappy with the people who are close to you. Maybe you're unable to function at work, and that this is mental health issues, and that these need to be dealt with because they relate to whatever the original trauma was that triggered it. He's aware of it, so he's sensitive to it. And in that, he's a real pioneer. And I think that he's not a pioneer in the 1970s. I think as the leader of Hasidim, who took them to a place where there was enormous trauma, he was dealing with this already in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I assure you, it comes out in the pages of the book, he recognizes his own PTSD and his own trauma. And he recognizes, if I've got trauma and I need connection and I need people around me, I'm a lonely old man, I'm in my 80s, I need people around me. These people who are in a much worse situation than I am, they definitely need people. That's what he's trying to tell Rabbi Kleinman at Avat Shalom. Sadly, he doesn't find much help there, because it was the 1970s and people were just beginning to get to talk about it. And I don't think that it's just for you and Nicole and for me as rabbis to deal with this. I think everybody has to deal with it. Every family has situations which result sometimes in short-term PTSD, but sometimes long-term PTSD. We're only just learning to deal with it and to define it and to understand it. And it can be people who just were very shocked by October 7th, very triggered, and suddenly became paranoid, or somebody who's now paranoid about anti-Semitism, and it causes mental health issues that are not recognized. And everyone always thinks, yeah, there's people far worse off than me, I don't need to deal with it. Not at all. Your mental health is really important. Even if there's other people with worse problems than you need to get help. And I think one of the messages that emerges from Paradise Cove is that we all have a role to play. I said that George Nagel, the Yablon Rebbe, was the master of reinvention. He reinvents himself as a mental health expert, as a kindly soul who just is there to help people. In the interview that he gave, he said, I gave up my phone number, told people you can call me at any time. Now, today that wouldn't be allowed. He gave out his private phone number, and people did call him at 8 o'clock in the morning at home on a Saturday, and he picked up the phone. So he had this sensitivity to mental health. We all need to have that sensitivity and not just think it's people who have to go into a psych ward. It could be the guy you sit next to in shul, or the guy you're at work with, or the guy that could be the checkout counter in Ralph's. Mm-hmm. That person has got mental health issues because of trauma that they've suffered in their life or are suffering right now. We need to be sensitive to it.
So I want to conclude with two questions. The first is the transition back to the Oblona Rebbe in Israel. What got him back there? And there's a quote that I have here that said, when he got back to Israel, the people told him, "You saved our lives." And he was the Rebbe again. What did that mean, that he saved their lives? And two, back to the beginning question, which we sort of went off on this amazing journey. How did you find this story? So one, how did he save their lives and get back to Israel?
I could never find him. When I originally discovered him, I did find, so what I discovered was a pamphlet issued by JNF KKL, which showed a picture of him with his Chassidim in Kfar Chassidim, but there was no information at that time on the internet.
And you had known of the Yablon Rebbe or not?
No, I didn't know anything. I just knew that there was this man called the Yablon Rebbe who'd created Kfar Chassidim. That's what I discovered, I would say about 20 years ago, when I first bought that pamphlet. It was such a curious story because I'd heard kind of there were Chassidim who were Zionists, but it never dawned on me that Kfar Chassidim was one of those places. There's actually yeshiva in Kfar Chassidim, in Rechasim, which is next to Kfar Chassidim, but it's a Litvish yeshiva, Lithuanian-oriented, non-Chassidic yeshiva. I'd never associated Kfar Chassidim with real Chassidim. I just didn't know that. So when I discovered him, I heard that he had moved. There was an article from the 1950s I think in Davar in Israel, that said that he had moved to America, lived in Los Angeles, and he changed his name to George Nickel.
Right.
Didn't live in Los Angeles in those days. Like when I did eventually move to Los Angeles, I asked around, I did a bit of research. No one ever heard of George Nickel. Of course they didn't, because his name wasn't George Nickel, it was George Nagel. I guess it was a typo. Nun Yud Gimel Lamed changed to Nun Yud
Cool.
Kuf Lamed.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was the typo in Davar in the newspaper.
Wow.
And I couldn't find him. And eventually I was on my way to Israel in 2018 with my son and his post-high school trip. And I emailed somebody from Kfar Hasidim on the plane who turned out to be his niece. Just remarkable coincidence.
So you did it because of a certain reason of her role, right? She was
she was an archivist.
Exactly.
She ran tours of the Jezreel Valley out of Kfar Hasidim. So I was sure that she must know. I mean, come on, if anyone knows about who the Yablon Rebbe is. So I emailed her from the plane, and I got an email back. My email was, "Have you ever heard of the Yablon Rebbe?" And I was hoping the answer was yes. And it came back, 10 minutes later. Of course I've heard of him. He was my uncle.
That's
So
amazing.
I met her, and I'm still a good friend. Her name is Shoshi Yonai. In fact, on October 7th, Shmini Atzeres, that night, when we began to hear about 10 o'clock at night about what was going on in Israel, she was with us. She was in our sukkah.
Oh my gosh.
You can imagine.
Wow.
Her and her son were with us in the sukkah. She would have to be on a visit to California. And we began to hear the terrible news out of Israel. But she was the one who introduced me to George Nagel. And then when I got back to Los Angeles, I found out much more. So she showed me the book, the original galley copy of the book, which I guess was a pre-publication version of what the ultimately published book was going to look like. It was never published. And I imagine that no publisher would publish a book by an unknown author, and they didn't know his backstory, and he wasn't revealing it. And he'd never submitted it for his master's. I have a feeling had he submitted this book, he wouldn't have got it anyway, right? It doesn't bear scrutiny in any kind of academic fashion. And he moved back to Israel because his nephew finally convinced him to come back. He was still scared of the hostility, but when he returned, they prepared a reception for him. And at the reception were all the people he'd brought with him who were still alive.
Right.
And they stood up one after the other and they said, "Rebbe, you saved our lives." Yes. Literally. If it wouldn't be for you, we would have been killed by the Nazis. And of course, there's past, but where have you been? You're the one who brought us here. You're the one who built this place. This is my son. This is my grandchild and my grandchildren. All of these people owe their lives to you. Like a sort of mini Schindler, right? Before the Holocaust, he'd already brought them out. And he saved hundreds, and now, of course, it's many thousands of people who survived the Holocaust, who managed to get away from the horrible Nazi genocide machine as a result of him bringing them to pre-state Israel and setting up Kfar Hasidim. He was so moved by that he grew back his beard, he put his yarmulke back on. You can see the pictures on paradisecovebook.com. I've put a few pictures there of him in his final stages of his life. You can see he's back to being the Yablon Rebbe again, and that's how he died and was buried. He's buried in Kfar Hasidim, and on his gravestone it says, "Here lies the Yablon Rebbe, Rabbi Yecheskel Taub." No mention of George Nagel, founder of Kfar Hasidim.
As you can see, my speechless expression. It's truly a miraculous story. In terms of the connection to CSUN right now, is two local rabbis here that are literally down the road. What has that been like? Have you been able to reach?
I did try. I've contacted them. Besides for the interview, which I discovered, there was a fellow called Norman Tannis, who was the librarian, and he filmed a whole bunch of videos of people at CSUN that he called People of Achievement. And one of the people he interviewed was George Nagel. It's not very professional. You can watch it online. It's on my website, rabbidunner.com. Just look for George Nagel interview, and you'll find it. It's long and it's not well edited. It's not even well filmed, to be honest. But it's fascinating to watch this man. At that stage, he's not Yablon Rebbe. He's little old George Nagel, dressed in a 70s style shirt, no yarmulke, a little bit reticent to talk about his Jewish background in any kind of religious sense. He's completely cultural and ethnic as opposed to Jewish in a religious sense. So that they did then make it available online. They can't find any reference to Paradise Cove. I asked them, do they know which facility it was? They don't have any records.
Wow.
I asked for the head of the psychology department to give me a letter for the book to put into the book. She refused. Don't ask me why. I sent her a copy of the manuscript. She said she wasn't interested.
Wow.
So I would love to have more cooperation out of CSUN. If anybody's watching this, who can get CSUN to recognize George T. Nagel, aka the Yabloner Rebbe, in some way, that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing to do.
I feel like we definitely need to make that our mission. And so as this book is released over the now as people watch this at the end of January, I guess what's the message for us in this year ahead? In the secular year, we're 2026. We just finished Hanukkah in the Jewish year. We're figuring out where our Zionism is, where our Jewish diaspora identity is. What would the Yablona Rebbe look at us as Jews in the diaspora today with our eye always towards Israel? And what would be his drash at this moment to us?
I think that the story of his life is proof that it's never too late to make a difference. And if at the age of 80, this man who's lived through every single type of challenge that a person can go through, one of the things we didn't mention is that he was married, he didn't have children, and then his wife was murdered in the Holocaust. Besides for everything else. And at the end of his life, at the age of 80, he volunteers at a mental health facility where he becomes, for all intents and purposes, somebody else's dog's body and schlepper, to do little menial tasks to help people in mental health patients. If he could do that, knowing his background, there's so much that we can do.
Yes.
And certainly in our very materialistic society, where all we're ever looking to do is go on the next big vacation and get the next big car and watch the next great show on Netflix, I think we can find time in our day, in our week, and in the course of our lives to do things that make a difference for other people. And he did it. And not only that, at the end of his life, he changed direction again and became a Rebbe again. We all have that in us. We all have that capacity. We all have that ability, and we can all make the difference. It doesn't matter where we are and what stage of life we're in. We can do something and make a difference.
We are honored to have Rabbi Penny Denner from Young Israel North Beverly Hills and Sinai Speaks in this wonderful series of educators, scholars, teachers, and rabbis. If you have not gotten the book yet, please do so. You can get it on Amazon as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it's on Amazon.
Paradise Cove, The Escape from the Cuckoo's Nest, a unbelievable story of the Yablona Rebbe that, again, probably 99% of Jews today have never heard of. George Nagel, also maybe never heard of, but a true story of transformation in this time where it is desperately, desperately needed. It's a true bracha to be in conversation, to learn with you and from you. And we look forward to much more learning together, Rabbi Denner. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everybody.